So, hello everyone. Warm evening to each one of you. I hope you all had a great weekend. And so, let's move on with the main session today. Let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Steve. Is your screen is visible?
So, so today we are going to see about David Brainerd. Uh, Anyone knows about him here? Have you guys heard of him before? Anyone else? Okay, so even yeah, I never heard of him before. So when I got this, so I went through his story. I went through his journals, and I was really moved by his story. So David Brainerd, he is actually American missionary to the Native Americans, who had a particularly fruitful ministry among the Delaware Indians of New Jersey. So he was born on April 20, 1718, and he lived a very short life. He lived only 29. He died when he was 29 years old, and he served among the Indians or the Native Americans in the west and the southern parts of the US. So, yeah, he lived a short life and died at the age of 29. During his short life, he was challenged by many difficulties, which we'll talk about now. And yeah, his story has inspired many people, including William Carey, Jim Elliot, who had been a great missionary, and his very own cousin, the second great awakening evangelist, James Bryan Taylor. All these people, David Brenner had a huge impact on them when they came to know about David's life. So he was born in Haddam, Connecticut, and his father Hezekiah was a Connecticut legislator, and he died when David was 9 years old, and he died at the age of 46. He had nine siblings, and his mother Dorothy also died very shortly after his father died. Within 5 years after his father died, his mom also died. So he was left orphan at the age of 14. He was so emotionally traumatized by all these difficulties in the early life itself. So one can imagine losing both their parents at a very young age. So it must have been really difficult. So that was his early life. And after his mother's death, he moved to East Haddam to live with one of his older sister, Jerusha. So during these days, he had uh, a quarrel kind of in spiritual with God. He had been struggling to find his identity. He had been struggling to find his true faith. So he described his religion during these years as a very careful and serious, but having no true grace. Even though he was born and brought up in a Christian family, he did not have the encounter with God so far. So he was just trying hard to find his true identity and on what his faith was laid upon. So at the age of 19, he inherited a farm near Durham, but he did not enjoy the experience of farming, and neither was his heart in it. But he had a desire to study at the Yale, which is a very famous university, and he wished to study there and become a pastor or a minister. So he longed a liberal education. In fact, Brainerd was a contemplative and scholar from head to toe. He was very good at studies, and at some point he has been expelled from Yale University. If he had not expelled, then he would have been a very great minister, or might be a pastor in some church, rather than becoming a missionary to the Indians. So that was all a part of God's plan, which we will see now in few minutes. Uh, after he gave up his farming, he returned to East Haddam a year later to prepare to enter for the Yale University. So that was on the summer of 1738. So this was the his life turning moment, we can say, because he had his first encounter with God at the age of 20. He had that, and he described his conversion occurring during a walk in the woods. So yeah, during that year on the farm, he had a commitment to God to enter uh, in the ministry, but still he was not converted. He had just an idea that he wants to go and serve God, but he wasn't very much into the faith and spiritual life. So he read the Bible through twice that year and began to see more clearly that all his religion was legalistic and simply based on his own efforts. He had great quarreling with God within his soul. So he always struggled in the initial period, just like all of us struggled with our faith, struggled with our own doubts and fears and anxieties which we had been going through. And initially, when we encounter God, so in the same way, he rebelled against original sin and against the strictness of the divine law and against the sovereignty of the God. So he also quarreled with the fact that there was nothing he could do in his own strength to commend himself to God. So we all must have gone through this situation at once in a time in our life where we would have struggled to find a true identity, where our true identity lies in, and where does our help comes from, and where our faith and hope rests upon. So that was the same thing which he also went through, but he was going through a lot. And during that time, just after a year, half an hour before the sunset in a particular day, at the age of 21, he was in a lonely place trying to pray. So this is one of his sayings in this is what he wrote in one of his journals. As I was walking in a dark thick grave, unspeakable glory seemed seemed to open to the view and apprehension of my soul. It was a new inward apprehension or view that I had of God, such as I never had before, nor anything that I had the least remembrance of it, so that I stood still and wondered and admired. I had now no particular apprehension of any one person of the Trinity, either the Father, Son, or the Holy Spirit, but it appeared to be divine glory and splendor that I then beheld, and my soul rejoiced with joy unspeakable to see such a God, such a glorious divine being, and I was inwardly pleased and satisfied that He should be God over all forever and ever. My soul was so captivated and delighted with the excellency, the loveliness, and the greatness and the other perfections of God that I was even swallowed up in Him, at least to that degree that I had no thought, as I remember at first, about my own salvation or scars that there was such a creature as I. Thus the Lord, I trust, brought me to a hearty desire to exalt him, to set him on the throne, and to seek first his kingdom, that is principally and ultimately to aim at his honor and glory as the king and sovereign of the universe, which is the foundation of the religion of Jesus. I felt myself in a new world. So this was a remarkable time in his life, because though he had the first encounter with God prior, this was the time when he fully realized what was happening around him, and he fully came to know about the Lord. And finally his eyes were opened, and he started to build up his spiritual life slowly on. He had a great faith. So yeah, this was the time when he started growing in the Lord, and he started spending time with him. He started writing, and he started thinking and talking all the theological doctrines and so on. So after this, he had 2 months later, he entered Yale University to prepare for the ministry. It was a hard beginning because there was this discrimination going on between upperclassmen and the lower classmen, and there was very little spirituality among the people, and the studies were of course very difficult at the initial stage. And he got measles and had to go home for several weeks during that first year. So the reason he died was, which now the studies show that he died with tuberculosis. He had been suffering from this from the very young age, from the time he entered into college. So the next year he was sent home because he was so sick that he was spitting blood. So even at this early age, yeah, he had the tuberculosis, and later, seven years later, he would die of this disease. So the amazing things may not uh, be that he died so early and accomplished so little, but that being as sick as he was, he lived as long as he did and accomplished so much. So he lived a very short life, but uh, the impact he had on the world was very great. And all the people, especially in the US, who later became missionaries and who came to different parts of the world, they were all moved by his stories. And so the spiritual awakening at Yale. So after he had been sent back to home, he was there for a year, and when he came back to Yale, he found out that there was a very drastic change in the spiritual life of each and every people. So George Whitefield, who was a great evangelist at that time, had been there, and now many students was very serious about their faith, which suited Brainerd well because he was very well in spiritual with God, and he longed for this actually. So when he found out that people had taken about their faith serious, and this favored him, and he was relieved, kind of. So, in fact, tensions were emerging between the awakened students and the less excited faculty and staffs. So, the drastic spiritual climate change, this happened only among the students, and the faculties and the staffs. They weren't excited about this, and they wanted to suppress all these movements and talks regarding faith and beliefs. So in 1741, Pastor Evangelists Gilbert Tennant, Ebenezer, and James Davenport, they fanned the flames of discontent among the students with their fiery preaching. So these people, these pastors or evangelists, they came to the college. They preached among the students, and their preaching was on fire. That all the students were really moved by the preaching they had. And Jonathan Edward, who is a dear friend of David Brainerd, and in whose home David Brainerd was there till his death. Basically, Jonathan Edward was a person who had published the journals which David was writing in his diary, and Jonathan published those journals which he had, and he published it as a book, a life story of David Brainerd. So people didn't know much about David even after his death, like even during his death. But after his death, Jonathan Edwards went through the journals of David, which was in his home, and he later took all those journals and his writings and his teachings, and he later then published it. And he was a uh, very loving guy, and his whole family, they used to warmly welcome anyone who wants to stay in their home. So just as the way David stayed in their home, he would welcome anyone to stay in their home, and these people were really nice to everyone around them. So Jonathan Edward was invited to preach the commencement address in 1741 in the hopes that he would pour a little water on the fire and stand up for the faculty against the enthusiasm of the students. Some faculty had even been criticized as being unconverted. So these faculties and the staffs, they called Jonathan Edward, hoping that he would uh, make the situation subside, but it turned out to be the other way. And some faculties were even criticized as being unconverted or unbelieved, kind of things. And so when Edward came, he preached a sermon called the Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Spirit of God, and totally disappointed the faculty and the staff. So he argued that the work going on in awakening of those days, and specifically among the students, was a real spiritual work in spite of the excess. So his preaching turned out to be the other way, rather than what the faculty and the staffs thought. And he told that all those awakening movements at those times among the students was really the work of the spirit, and that he totally supported it because it was a work of the Lord and God was on the move. So that was his statement. So that very morning, the following statement had been voted by the college trustees, that if any student of this college shall directly or indirectly say that the rector, either of the trustees or tutors, or are hypocrites, carnal, or unconverted men, he shall for the first offense make a public confession in the hall, and for the second offense be expelled. So this was the statement or the rule made by the college shortly after Jonathan had preached on that day. So this was a rule which was laid, but this rule did not affect, like this did not had any impact on David because he was very strong in his faith. He talked what he talked straightly. If anything is wrong or right, he stood in the right path. And yes, so as a result, he was expelled from the college. So what happened was, Brainerd was in the crowd as Edward spoke, and one can't help but wonder whether Edward later felt some responsibility for what happened to Brainerd the next term. So later after Brainerd was expelled, Edward came to know that he was expelled, obviously, and he had later felt if he was responsible for his expulsion. So this was the thoughts which Edwards had later. So Brainerd was at the top of his class. As I said, he was very good at his studies and academically he was outstanding student, but was summarily expelled in the yearly 1742 during his third year of college. So he was overheard to say that one of the tutors. So what happened was, David was speaking to one of the freshmen of that year. So he was talking to that freshman about a particular tutor called Chauncey Whittlesey. And he told that this particular tutor has no more grace than a chair. He pointed to a particular chair and he said, this tutor has no more grace than a chair. So this was very straightforward statement made by David, and he didn't worry about the rules which laid by the trustees of the college. But he just said this to the freshman, and the freshman then said it to faculty, and then it went to the board members and so on. So, and also he wondered why the rector did not drop down dead for finding students for their evangelical. So this was two of his statements uh, made by David, and of course this talk had been reached. Um, it has it it reached at once to the governing bodies of the whole college, and he was asked to make a public confession at that time. But David refused to make a public confession. He said, I would do a private, because I said these things in private, and I would not make a public confession. And and he was subsequently expelled. And this expulsion wounded Brainerd very deeply because his desire was to pass out in the Yale University, and he wanted to be a minister or the pastor and serve God, either in a community or in a church or somewhere like that. But when he was expelled from the university, he was very deeply wounded, and he was very hurt that he couldn't complete his studies. So he tried again and again in the next several years to make things right. Numerous people also came to help, but they couldn't help at all. So, but God had another plan for Brainerd. Instead of quite 6 years in the pastorate and or lecture hall, followed by death, because while he was doing his college, obviously in the next 7 years, he will be leading to his death. So yes, instead of a quite 6 years in being a pastor, or being in a lecture hall followed by death and little historical significance at all, God meant to drive him into the wilderness that he might suffer for his sake and make an incalculable impact on the history of missions. So many often we try to we have a plan in our mind that whether it to be serve God in one way or another. But if things doesn't go out well, and if the way in front of us is blocked, then we often feel broken down, and we often feel low that why is this happening, because we had the mind of serving God in that way, but still that plan is not working out. So many a times we often feel broken, but God has planned. He has every, like, if one thing is happening in our life, then it must happen only if God allows it. So God has a plan for each and every one of us, even though our plans don't work out well. So this is one of the if we see, before the way was cut off for him to the pastorate, Brainerd had no thought of being a missionary to the Indians. So before this way was cut out, or the door shut down in front of him, he had just set his mind to be a pastor or a minister and serve in the church or organization as well. But he had no thought in being a missionary or go to the remote area and preach gospel to the people, to the native people of that land. So but now he had to rethink his whole life. So basically what he did was he took time, he started to rethink his whole life, what had happened to him. So there was a law recently passed that no established minister could be installed in Connecticut uh, who had not been graduated from Harvard, Yale, or a European university. So this was a law passed in his times, that if a person didn't graduate from Harvard or Yale or any European university, then he is not to be given the license for preaching or being a minister or pastor. So this law, after hearing this law, it made Brainerd very low. He felt cut off from his life calling, which he thought was his call to be a pastor or a minister. So there was a tremendous lesson here which he learned. So God is at work for the glory of his name and the good of his church, even when the good intentions of his servants fail, even when that failing is owing to sin or carelessness. One careless word spoken in haste, and Brennet's life seemed to fall apart before his eyes. So, but God knew better, and Brennett came to accept it. So gradually, Brennett uh, took time. He had to rethink his whole life, and he accepted the ways which was shut down for him. He didn't struggle with it. He accepted it, and in fact, we are tempted to speculate whether the modern missionary movement that was so repeatedly inspired by Brainett's missionary life would have happened if David Brainerd had not been expelled from Yale or cut off from his hopes to serve God in the pastorate. So the whole missionary movement, the modern missionary movement, was uh, majorly brought out by David Brainerd, and we have to think whether this movement would have happened if David had not been expelled from the university, and if he had like passed out from the university, and if he continued to serve God in being a pastor or a minister. So yeah, after he had to rethink his whole life, and he had accepted the way, and he started trusting God more than his own plans. And in the summer of 1742, a group of ministers sympathetic to the Great Awakening called New Lights. So this is basically a group of ministers or a organization, you can say, or a committee, and these people, they licensed Brainerd to preach. So the Brainerd was under their organization, and he came under their rules and regulations, and they licensed him to preach. And Jonathan Dickinson, who was the leading Presbyterian in New Jersey, took an interest in Brainerd's life, and he tried to get him reinstated in Yale. But of course, he couldn't help Brainerd get back to his college. When that failed, he made Brainerd become a missionary to the Indians. When that failed, under the influence of the Great Awakening, the New Lights organization or the committee, Brainerd became a missionary to the native Indians of the US states under the sponsorship of the commissioners of the Society in Scotland for propagating Christian knowledge. So Dickinson was one of those commissioners. So Jonathan Dickinson, he helped David get into this society and serve under them as a missionary to the native Indians of the US states. So finally, on November 25th, 1742, Brainerd was examined and for his fitness for the work and appointed as a missionary to the Indians. So his first assignment was to the Houstonic Indians at the Conomic, about 20 miles northwest of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where Edward would eventually serve as a missionary to the Indians. So he arrived April 1, 1743, and preached for 1 year using an interpreter because it was really difficult for him to learn the native language because the tutor or with whom he had to learn the language, he lived 20 miles away from where he was staying. So it was really challenging. So he had to use an interpreter and try to learn the language. He tried so hard from John Surgeon, who was the veteran missionary at Stockbridge. He was able to start school for Indian children and translate some of the Psalms. And then came a reassignment to go to the Indians along the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. Yeah. So on May 1, 1744, he left Conomic and settled in the Forks of Delaware, northwest of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And at the end of the month, he wrote to Newark, New Jersey, to be examined by the Newark Presbytery and was ordained on June 11, 1744. Brainerd preached to the Indians at the Forks of the Delaware for 1 year. So this had been a very remarkable incident in his life and very remarkable incident at that place, which took a major turn in the history of the mission. In the history of the community among the US states. So on June 19, 1745, he made his first preaching to the Indians at the Crossbeak Sun, this particular place, Crossbeak Sun, New Jersey, where he had his most fruitful ministry. This was a place where God moved in amazing power, and God was on the move at this place and brought awakening and blessing to the Indians. Within a year, there were 130% in his growing assembly of believers, and he had baptized each one of them in a river by side. And the whole Christian community moved to Crosswinksum to Cranberry in May 1746 to have their own land and village and start a Christian community there. So Brainerd stayed with these Indians until he was too sick to minister. And in November 1746, he left Cranberry to spend 4 months trying to recuperate in Elizabethtown at the house of Jonathan Dickinson. So on March 20, 1747, David Brainerd made one last visit to his Indian friends uh, at the Crossbixon place and then rode to the house of Jonathan Edward in the Northampton, Massachusetts uh, on May 28, 1747. So, and also he made one last trip to Boston during the summer and then returned and died of tuberculosis in Edward's house on October 9, 1747. So Brainerd had a very deep impact on very deep impact on many people's lives. So it was a very short life, 29 years, 5 months, and 19 days. Only 8 of those years as a believer, and only 4 of those as a missionary. One obvious reason is that Jonathan Edward took the diaries and published them as the Life of Brainerd in 1749. And John Wesley say, "Let every preacher read carefully over the life of Brainerd." Why was it written of Henry Martin that pursuing the life of David Brainerd, his soul was filled with the holy emulation of that extraordinary man, and after deep consideration and fervent prayer, he was at length fixed in a resolution to imitate his life. Why did William Carey regard Edward's life of Brainerd as a sacred text? Why did Robert Morrison and Robert McCain of Scotland and John Mills of America and Frederick Schwartz of Germany and David Livingstone of England and Andrew of South Africa and Jim Elliot, of course, of modern America took upon Brainerd with a kind of awe and draw power from him the way they and countless others did. So John Piper also says that Brainerd's life is a vivid, powerful testimony to the truth that God can and does use weak, sick, discouraged, beat down, lonely, struggling saints who cry to Him day and night to accomplish amazing things for His glory. David Brainerd quotes that, "Let me forget the world and to be and be swallowed up in the desire to glorify God." So he didn't worry about his sickness. He didn't. Of course, he had the sickness, but he overcame all that because he had a greater desire to glorify God rather than the trials and obstacles which were uh, on front of him. So there are few struggles which Brenner had. First, he struggled with almost constant sickness. He had been sick from the very young age when he started going to college, and he had to drop out of it as a reason. And he was vomiting blood, and that's why he had to drop out of college for a year. And he also says that he rode several hours in the rain through the howling wilderness, although I was so disordered in body that little or nothing but blood came from me. In August 1746, he also wrote that, "Having lain in cold sweat all night, I coughed much bloody matter this morning and was under great disorder of the body and not a little melancholy." Is basically a severe form of depression. So he also described in many sentences. He also describes how violent and how he was struggling with his health. His health condition was very miserable, and he also says that exercised with a violent cough and a considerable fever, and had no appetite to any kind of food, and frequently brought up what I ate as soon as it was done, and often times had little rest in my bed by reasons of pain in my breast and back, was able, however, to ride over to my people about 2 miles every day and take care of some of those who were then at work upon a small house for me to reside in amongst the Indians. So the doctors who were at the Jonathan Edwards when David was in his house had said that he had an incurable consumption and did not have long life to live. So in the last couple of months during his suffering was very tremendous, and in that great distress that I he also said that in the greatest distress that ever I endured, having an uncommon kind of hiccup which either strangled me or threw me into a straining to vomit. So there are very few statements about where he explains his health condition, and I would all urge you to go through his journals when you get time and learn more about his life and his struggles and how he overcame this. So, second, he struggled with relentlessly recurring depression. As a very young age, he had been orphaned at the age of 14, and losing his both mom and dad, he was very much affected mentally and emotionally, and he had been struggling with his spiritual life. And later upon, he got a clear idea when he started spending time with God, and when he started taking uh, some he when he took time to read Bible, meditate upon it, and so on. So it is amazing how often Brenner pressed on with the practical necessities of his work in the face of these waves of discouragement. So often he writes down in writings or in his journals, whenever he was going through these depressions, he would pour out his heart to God and he would cry out to him every night, every day with the sickness he has been struggling with. And Brainerd also struggled with loneliness. So most of the time I hear, he says that most of the talk I hear is either Highland Scotch or Indian. I have no fellow Christian to whom I might unbosom myself and lay upon open my spiritual sorrows, and with whom I might take sweet counsel in conversation about heavenly things and join in social prayer. He had no one by his side with whom he can talk spiritually and with whom he can share his burden, spiritual burden, and the burden of his people. Because many times we need people with us to share our burdens. Uh, we often seek help from others, but he often struggled with loneliness. And but in the wilderness and the ministry he was all alone and could only pour out his soul to God, and God bore him and kept him going. Brainerd also struggled with immense external hardships. He had no proper food or proper shelter in spite of the sickness he had. In those places he was living in a wilderness, and he used to go to a place, he makes a tent for him and he lives there in that tent with the people among them. And in spite of all these terrible external hardships that Brennan knew, he pressed on and even flourished under these tribulations that led to the kingdom. So he often says he was exposed to cold rain and all this hotness in the wilderness. He was ready to please myself. He says that I was ready to please myself with the thoughts of enjoying a comfortable house, a warm fire, and the other outward comforts. But now these have less place in my heart, because he started to place God in front of him, and he had a greater desire to serve God, no matter what were the hardships laid in front of him. And he also struggled with a bleak outlook on nature. So it is a sad thing that Brainerd was blinded, of course, by his difficulties, his health, his loneliness, his depressions, and he was blinded, and he did not have the exposure to the nature in that place in the wilderness. Brenner did not draw strength and refreshment from God's glory, gallery of joy, because his suffering made it so hard for him to see. But we must make every effort not to succumb with him here. Spurgeon and Edwards are the models for us on ministerial uses of nature. Brainerd struggled to love the Indians. If love is known by sacrifice, then Brainerd loved. If it is also known by heartfelt compassion, then Brainerd struggled to love more than he did. So, in one of his journals, he says that I felt my heat drawn out after God in prayer, almost all the forenoon, especially while riding, and in the evening could not help crying to God for those poor Indians. And after I went to bed, my heart continued to go out to God for them till I dropped asleep. Oh, blessed be God that I may pray. So Bennett struggled with the rise and fall of love with his own heart for these native Indians. He loved but longed to love so much more. So he also struggled to stay true to his calling when his path was shut down. He struggled. Of course, everyone struggles, but in spite of being struggled, he held on to God and he trusted Him and had faith on Him. So he struggled to stay true to his calling. Often we also struggle to stay true to our callings. Sometimes we often have something in our minds. We often make up our mind and we make plans, but if that doesn't turns out to be good, then we break down. And but we often should remind ourselves that we have a God in control, and that our hope should be on Him alone. So Brainerd's passion to press on for God's kingdom was immarkable passion The reason was Brennet's life had powerful effects on people is that in spite of all his struggles, he has never give up his faith or his ministry. He was consumed with the passion to finish his race and honor his master and spread the kingdom and advance in personal holiness. It was this unswearing allegiance to the cause of Christ that makes the bleakness of his life glow with glory. He says that when I really enjoyed God, I feel my desire of Him the more insatiable, and my thirstings after holiness the more unquenchable. Oh, for holiness! Oh, for more of God in my soul! Oh, this pleasing pain! It makes my soul press after God. Oh, that I might not loiter on my heavenly journey. He also says that, oh, I long to fill the remaining moments all for God, though my body was so feeble and weary with preaching and much private conversation. Yet I wanted to sit up all night to do something for God. To God, the giver of these refreshments, be glory forever and ever. Amen. And he also continues on saying that my soul was refreshed and comforted, and uh, I could not but bless God, who had enabled me in some good measure to be faithful in the day past, and how sweet it is to be spent and worn out for God. So all these writings here, it was in his journals which he had written down, and along with prayer, Brainerd pursued holiness and usefulness with fasting. Again and again in his diary, he tells of the day spent in fasting. He fasted for guidance when he was perplexed about the next steps of his ministry, and he fasted simply with the deep hope of making greater advances in his own spiritual depth and his usefulness in bringing life to the Indians. When he was dying in Edward's house, he urged young ministers who had come to visit him to engage in frequent days of private prayer and fasting because of how useful it was. Also, spent his day reading, writing, thinking about theological things. So this is how he spent his life, and we can learn few things from Bennett's life and the methods he had used in his life. So first thing, he was a man of prayer. He was a man of prayer. He fasted, he prayed, and as his ministry developed, he became more burden for the people. He prayed for them, though he struggled, though he had sickness, though he was depressed and felt lonely. He never stopped praying. He never ceased praying. He was always on his knees praying to God and seeking help from Him. And the second thing was Christ-centered preaching. His preaching emphasized the love of God. Stick to the right doctrine, and he stuck to the biblical theology, and he did not deviate here and there, or but he had stick to the gospel and the main reason of the gospel and the main things which is to be shared in the gospel of why God came and how He died for our sins and all those basic concepts. And he also practiced public baptism. So he wasn't afraid of anyone. He publicly baptized 130 people, 130 Indians in the Crosspeak Sun, and he wasn't afraid of of the people around them, but he had been bold. And the next thing was discipleship meeting. He often had meetings on Wednesdays and Thursdays where he would have a Q&A session with the community people, and he would talk to them, and he would teach them about the Old Testament and how the God led the Israelite people and all the events in the Old Testament. And he would have a Q&A session with the community people. And he also had next thing we can learn is he had a cultural studies, that is before going to a particular people to serve among them, he went through the people's history. Uh, he went through their cultural activities. He studied them basically as a whole community. So he studied the Indians, and that is why accordingly, he molded himself. He had to speak in a way in which the people will understand and accept the word of the God. And next thing is he had implemented many schools and Christian settlements, in that places he had in English school, where he would teach, where he started schools for a primary kids to learn English, which was very important language even at that time of even at that point of time. And also he was receptive to peoples. So what was that, when he left a particular community, he used to go to other community and he used to settle there. But after some time he used to get back to the old community where he was serving, and he used to check on those people whether are they doing fine and how is their spiritual life. So he used to have a routine checkup of the community while he is going around and preaching. And the last thing we can learn from him is church planting. He had planted a church in that Crosswick some place, and of course he couldn't continue to be a leader in the church because of his illness. And so his brother John Brainerd took over the church, and he had been the leader. And so he started churches. And there are quite a few things we can learn from his life, but these are the few points which I have put up, which was necessary, which I had felt necessary for us to know. So, yeah, if anyone is yeah, so thank you so much for the time, and thank you all so much for listening. And I would like to ask if